Gmail or SHCI?
SHCI. Okay. And a free chat. All right. Let me see. There's somebody in the waiting room. I see that. See that thing? So we.
Yeah, sorry, I am sitting in a different conference and it's lunch break right now.
Okay.
So I'll be in and out, but I'm on my phone.
I will start letting the people in, and in between, in the last 2 minutes, we can answer the question, how long the pandemic will last.
All right, I'll let people in as they come in.
Yeah, I must ask you, you have a wonderful Italian name. Are you Italian?
Would that be me you're asking?
Yes, Lucia.
Unfortunately or fortunately not. I'm Colombian, married to an Italian American.
Ah.
Yes. We try to keep it interesting here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I take it you're Italian? Maybe from Naples?
No, my dad's people come from a place outside of Naples called Avellino, and my mom's people come from the Südtirol, the way up north by the Austrian border.
Okay.
I would imagine the food in your house is delicious. Colombian and Italian. Wow, that's cool.
There were years when I cooked, Dr. Giordano, you should know, but now that my children are in their 20s, I absolutely don't.
I'm sure the food in your house was wonderful, and I'm great reservations at restaurants.
Let me know when you're in Philadelphia. We'll do some cooking here at SHCI.
Oh, well, you're in Philly. I used to get up to Philly all the time because I used to do some work both at Penn and at Drexel.
There you go. That's exactly where I'm at.
Oh yeah, love Philly. Yeah, I got a buddy of mine, John Moreno at Penn. I put one of my postdocs up at Penn. Yeah, great place.
Excellent. Yes, we do have some great ethicists. So wonderful to hear about that.
Fun you guys making me hungry. Let's start. Okay.
All right. Well, that's my turn. Welcome to everyone. My name is Lucia DiNapoli, and I am very excited to host this session with our speakers, Dr. James Giordano and Dr. James Hughes. Our session is organized jointly by SHCI and USCS, entitled Innovation Frontiers 2021. And today we're going to focus on the brain and the mind, neural technologies. Chris, am I introducing this session next? Thank you. Brain-machine interface. Neurotechnologies in the form of brain-machine interfaces are currently being developed to address medical conditions to alleviate the suffering caused by diseases or injuries. However, it's not a secret in the industry that the long-term goal is to create an artificial, internet-connected overlay to the brain that enables users to interface with future intelligent machines. As the capabilities and applications of neural interfaces advance, the ethical challenges bring up questions around agency, identity, privacy, cognitive liberty, equity, abnormality, and justice. First, I have the honor and privilege of introducing Dr. Chris Lodansky, the president of SHCI, and Dr. Manel Camps, provost of Crown College University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Lodansky.
Thank you very much, Lucia. So first of all, let me introduce the moderators, and thank you very much for contribution to our efforts. So let's start from the Chris Gray. So Chris is the special figure. When I read his short bio, it totally blew my mind. We're talking about the author of the Postmodern Era, War, Cyborg, Citizen, and Peace, War and Computers. What can be better? He's well established in the field of the brain-machine interface and the cyborg era. He published over 200 peer-reviewed articles in dozen disciplines in the fields. He worked at the UCSD Crown College when he teaches, and I'm sure the students love him because even from the very short introduction I have at the beginning, he's exciting person. The second moderator is my partner in crime, Luca Di Napoli, works at University of Pennsylvania. He's one of the founders of the Society of Healthcare Innovation. At University of Pennsylvania, he leads several efforts aimed at the initiatives in the field of the nursing research. She's also coach and owner of the company Trajectory Consulting. She focused a lot on the question of the equity, diversity, and justice. And she's one of the persons who actually prepared this conference last year and successfully actually gave us a framework to continue this year. I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Kamps now.
All right. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to now introduce the two sponsoring agencies. The first one is the Society for Healthcare Innovation. This was founded in 2020 by a group of healthcare professionals caring about healthcare solutions, looking for healthcare solutions. They're really building a community of healthcare innovators and promoting educational awareness through a number of events and social media. They also have an annual conference and also advancing the professional connections of their members. Their goal is really to empower their members to find and create new value and innovative solutions for healthcare. Crown College is one of the 10 colleges at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Our theme is looking into the impacts of technology on society. We have a center called the Center for Applied Ethics and Values of Advanced Technologies, CAVIAT, who's the part that Crown that's really co-sponsoring this conference. And we also have a collaboration with an organization called Get Virtual that uses technology to assist local businesses during the pandemic. And I'm excited about this conference and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Kamps. So now let's go over the plan and the flow of the conference. So here you see a format. We're essentially going to go about 90 minutes from our start. We'll have two presentations. There will be no break between them, and each one will run approximately 10 to 15 minutes. We'll have a question and answer immediately following those presentations, and we'll make a decision as to what the energy of the room is, to stay within a larger room or to go into breakout rooms. After that, we'll probably most likely have a hard stop at 3:30. Okay. Want to talk about some rules, or what we call netiquette. And our netiquette is basic. We've all been in this Zoom world or Teams world for quite a while. Make sure you have your audio muted. Allow our speakers that respect and time. Position your camera properly. Minimize any visual distractions. Should you speak and be invited to speak during a question and answer, be aware of any other noise. And should we go into breakout rooms, there'll be rules for that specifically. Otherwise, please know that this session is being recorded, and then obvious selected portions will be shared to the public throughout our social media, our website, and other channels. Okay. And now we'll be introducing the speakers. Dr. Chris Gray.
Our first speaker is James Giordano. Doctor and a master in philosophy. He's a professor at the Departments of Neurology and Biochemistry and chief of Neuroethics Studies program and chair of the subprogram in military medical ethics at Georgetown University Medical Center. He's also the executive director of the Institute for Biodefense Research, also in Washington, D.C., and is a distinguished professor of biotechnology, health promotions, and ethics at Coburg University of Applied Sciences in Coburg, Germany. Dr. Giordano is also the Distinguished Fellow in Science, Technology, and Ethics at the Stockdale Center for the United States Naval Academy and a Senior Fellow in Biosecurity, Technology, and Ethics at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He's a Senior Science Advisory Fellow of the SMA Branch, Joint Staff, Pentagon, and Senior Bioethicist of the U.S. Defense Medical Ethics Center. Dr. Giordano is the author of over 300 peer-reviewed publications, 7 books, and 35 governmental reports. And I know that's more work than writing a book, on bioscience and technology, biosecurity and ethics. And he is a former Fulbright Fellow, an elected member of the European Academy of Science and Arts, and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine in the UK. He's a former US naval officer holding designations in aerospace and physiologist, research physiologist, and research psychologist. He served with the US Navy. And it's a great honor for us to have him here with his combination of both academic, scientific, and military expertise. So we'll now turn the floor over to James G. If you want to refer to our two speakers, they should be James G. and James H. Dr. Giordano, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Do I have the capability to share my slides? I should. Huh? Let's try this. Okay. Very good. So a logistical question. I've been told I have a really great face for radio, so I don't think there's any real need for participants to see this ugly mug. I would prefer they pay attention to the slides. But if you guys want me on, I mean, I won't be insulted if you say no, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to also give this a little bit more bandwidth. So I'm going to stop my video so you can pay attention to the slides for now. And in so doing, what I really would like you to do is let's take a trip together. Let's talk a little bit about neuroscience and what neuroscience is. We have to consider neuroscience and its technologies as a relatively unified enterprise. Colloquially, we refer to this as neuro-S&T. And the reason for this is quite simple. I mean, throughout much of modern history, and I would argue throughout much of human anthropology, there's been this interesting dance of the tools we have at our disposal and the theories that we generate. And not just the theories, but then the tasks at hand to put those theories to work. And then we get to the limit of those task capabilities and we develop tools anew. This is historically old. And what happens is the development of those new tools then leads to development of new theories. In some cases, by a validation of those extant theories, and in other cases, by their revision, if not outright replacement. But the question then becomes, what are we doing with the tools? Well, characteristically, we've taken much of those tools to allow our observations, our access, and our capability to affect the external world so that that world would be somewhat more viable for our survivability and, in more recent times, our flourishing. But the internal world has always been something that's been at least an enigma to us and more capably something of a puzzle to understand what we are all about, to understand what others are all about. And clearly, the brain has been one of those foci. I mean, if we could talk about this field, neuroscience, and I've had the honor, privilege, and sometimes real benefit of being a brain scientist for almost 40 years this year. And I came into the field when it was relatively brand new. There are about 4 or 5 programs titularly dedicated to the neurosciences back in the late 70s. And now there are literally hundreds, not only in the United States, but worldwide. Hang on to that fact because it's going to be important momentarily. But that in no way defines or describes human interest in the brain and what it does. As I'm fond of saying, and I'll reiterate here without any apologies, I think that primordial humans at one point that had looked into some reflecting pool and thought, wow, that's me. And then very therefrom were the thoughts, well, I'm thinking about me and what makes me me. We take large centenary jumps and we go to the work of Rene Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Yeah, the flip side of that, Rene, is, yeah, what makes me think? Moving into the modern and postmodern era, increasingly we've used our tools, not just as observation and orientation, but our tools as instruments to be able to affect what are referred to as the 3 A's, the actual ability to assess the brain, access the brain, and to affect the brain, because we hold that the brain is at least important to this thing we call mind. Please bear in mind that the proverbial hard question of the neurosciences, in other words, how does mind occur? How does the great stuff of our consciousness and ideas actually occur in the gray stuff in our heads? We don't know that yet, but we may not even need to, because if we can develop a large enough repository of patterns, we can then access those patterns in viable ways to get outputs. We do it all the time. This then becomes solving a puzzle rather than pondering a mystery. So what are the tools and techniques we have at hand? Well, we can break neuroscience and technology into 3 major categoricals. Those tools that allow us to assess the brain, such things as biomarkers, genetics, genomics, imaging, brain modeling and mapping. And this sort of lays out the cartography, if you will, for things that we can then go on to access and affect, utilizing ever more sophisticated drugs. And I mean really sophisticated drugs that allow us to sharpshoot the brain almost at a molecular level rather than buckshotting it. Various forms of peripheral stimulation, both indwelling and donable and doffable, neurofeedback, electrical and magnetic transcranial modulation, deep brain stimulation, and some of that moving rapidly towards minimally, if not non-invasive deep brain stimulation that allows us to link humans to machines and computational systems remotely and in real time to allow various types of neuroorthotics and prosthetics. That's a really sophisticated way of saying this is an iterative process of what Professor Ablaze Gray has referred to as cyborgization, a cybernetic organism that revolves around the integration of machinery and technology into biology and its relative reciprocity. All of these things are force multiplied, capabilized, if you will, by big data and artificial intelligence technologies that take those data that are multi-scalar, multi-level, and massive and make sense of them. But now let's harken back to what I mentioned to you earlier. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of neuroscience and technology programs, and they're not limited geographically. There is a bit of a geopolitical limitation or distinction in that these initiatives are primarily those of developed countries, but that too raises a particular set of flags. What we find is that right now, on the global stage, we see multinational efforts and enterprises dedicating billions of national currencies to the brain sciences and the tools to assess and affect the brain, dramatically increasing Asian efforts, primarily in China, but not just. But China has been explicit in its claim that it's going to take up a greater part of the market space by 2035. The Chinese Brain Initiative defines key areas in which technology not only has biomedical implications and applications, but the spillover effect more broadly into public life, into occupational life, into wellness has been part of that initiative. In advancing developed nations, it also helps to capabilize developing nations. In other words, the sharing of the science and technology may be important to gain certain leverages to allow developing nations to then use that socioeconomically. And it also creates particular relationships between those nations that have neuroscience and technological capability, those that want it, and those that don't. And what this then does, and I apologize for the typo in the slide, what this then does is this establishes certain forms of leveraging and hegemonies, and it creates contingencies. This is what the French philosopher Michel Foucault referred to as biopower, and when harnessed in political frameworks, biopolitics. This then establishes this new area known as the bioeconomy, and more specifically, the neurobioeconomy. And we have to recognize the reality of the neurobioeconomy when considering, if you will, our neuroecology. Literally, ekos logos, from the Greek, oikos, home, logos, irrational accounting. How is it that our ecologies, what we do in our activities of daily living, whether occupational in terms of our work or occupational in terms of the way we go about our lives, are being increasingly influenced, affected by, and calling forth what the brain sciences can teach and deliver? The neurobioeconomy demands that we appreciate what our group has referred to as the big C's: scientific and sociopolitical convergence, as well as divergence, the collaborations in and across the sciences, cooperations in and across the sciences, as well as competitions in the sciences and internationally, as well as extant levels of competition that may prompt conflict and their contingencies. What are those contingencies? Now, culture, circumstance and context, the ability to control and leverage not just idiosyncratically, that we can control and perhaps therefore leverage individuals' experience of injury, disease, illness, wellness, performance, capabilization, but also systemically. In other words, what does that mean for the neuro-capabilized and the neuro-not capabilized, the proverbial neuro-haves or have-nots? And this moves ever more into the commercial space. You know, we see that there are a number of neuroscience and technology industries and commercial enterprises. The Neurotechnology Industries Organization has an entire roster of what that particular area looks like and its economic impact. And I think probably most salient is the work of Elon Musk, who talks about Neuralink, utilizing Neuralace type technology in ways that will link humans to machines and computational systems and access their brains and its processes in real time. Neuralink is not alone in that enterprise. Please understand that in many ways, what tends to happen is that the technology, once out of the proverbial box, becomes a usable entity, either directly or through something called fast following. And that fast following very often is dictated by culture, both as a medium and as a forum. Think literally of a petri dish. It's stuff you grow stuff in, but the parameters of that dish or the absence of said parameters then defines how that thing grows and where it spreads. Cultures are defined by their history, their needs, their values, and their philosophies. And those philosophies obtain and entail anthropologic factors, economical factors, and ethics. So as soon as you define or describe or detail or demonstrate, explicate that what you're using these technologies for is some definable good, well, you have to ask, who's good? By what rationality? Whose justice? To paraphrase the words of the philosopher Alistair McIntyre from University of Notre Dame. And then interestingly, it becomes a question of, well, what do you do in your own backyard? And what happens if the stuff you do in your backyard is leverageable, desirable, or not beyond your fence post? Here, I give you an illustration from a wonderful paper that came out a couple of years ago talking about Chinese neuroscience and technology, in which the quotes from antiquity and that are philosophically and culturally germane to the Chinese enterprises within government, within research, and within the commercial entity really bear fruit. Do not impose upon others what you yourself do not desire. Humans follow society, and a gentleman gets along with others, but does not necessarily agree with them. This then establishes the basis for a number of emerging and exigent trends in neuroscience and technology within the social milieu. If, in fact, my history, my culture, my values, my philosophy, my anthropology, and my politics establish a particular set of ethical parameters, and they're not necessarily the same as yours, if they allow particular latitudes, they allow particular freedoms, and in some ways don't particularly initiate or instantiate certain constraints, is it wrong for you to come to my country to do those things that you want to do? If, for example, I'll use a colloquial example. You know, if, let's say, if Junior can't have cake after dinner at home, but they go next door and the next door neighbor says, yeah, cake is fine. It's not going to kill you. It might even be good for you. It gives you tolerance to cake. A little bit is good. Is it wrong for Junior to do that? And I use the word junior importantly because neuroscience is relatively immature as a science, but it's rapidly developing at our own pace. We are the engineers of that evolution. And in many ways, it's adolescent, and there's an impulsivity that goes along with adolescence. But that adolescence defines adulthood. What does that mean if there are things that can be done elsewhere that can't be done here, wherever here is? The draw for research is huge, but then along with that goes issues of intellectual property rights, international law, and leverageability on the world stage. And if those things are translatable from the bench to the bedside and beyond, well, then what does that mean for medical tourism? Folks who want to go there, wherever there is, not just to do the research and get it done, but if that research does what research is supposed to do and get it done, well, then that might be very viable, not only for medical tourism, but for the institution of spillover effects, medicine in the preventative realm, the occupational realm, the lifestyle realm. And then what does this portend for things like intellectual property, economics, medical and social ecologies, and public health safety, and even biosecurity, when neuroscience and neurotechnology might be leveraged in those ways? The safety issues, I think, represent the low-hanging fruit, but safety and security tend to go hand in hand. One hand washes the other, they both wash the proverbial face. We're talking about safety. It's not just quality control or assurance. It's also appreciating heterogeneity of methods and technologies, and that in some cases, those differences will establish economic differences. In other words, if I'm getting something done in country X, I might have to go back to country X to have that thing sustained, maintained, lest I degrade into relative obsolescence. And if this involves technology, particularly in technology that has some perdurability in the individual, or if the data and information from that technology is accessible, might it also then be affectable, corruptible, manipulable? And what are the concerns that that would generate then about the relative constraints as regard to data security, neurodata, what Stephanie Kostyuk has referred to as neurological information, its non-discrimination and non-impacting security effects? Well, I tell you this because this is not science fiction. This is science fact. Preparation for these facts doesn't necessarily equal prevention, because we have to appreciate that there is relative promise of the positive outcomes in neuroscience and technology could obtain. Rather, it brings forth a readiness stance. It's focused, flexible, and has to be equally as fast moving to remain apace with the science and tech. It demands recognition and responsiveness to both idiosyncratic, in other words, individual, as well as systemic benefits, burdens, risks, threats, and even harms. If we look at those harms, we could parse them into essentially two categories. Those that are focal to the tech. I mean, remember, we don't know how the brain does what the brain does. And we're using the technology to figure that out, but also to define what is normal or not. And this brings us to the intersection of unknowns. What are the real capabilities and limitations of the tech and the brain? What are the validity of the information, the viability of the uses of these techniques? What happens if the science runs away from us, or we get what's called Wechselblad effects, in other words, unanticipated consequences? And then these social issues vary as a consequence of culture. Is the mind an inviolable space? Does that affect somebody with mind control, mind reading? What does that portend for consent when we don't know everything about what it is we're doing? Do these things represent treatments if, in fact, we are the ones who are using the science and technology to define norm or abnorm? And then do these things differ in terms of who's normal where based upon how the technology is utilized? We treat those things that are abnormal, but we enhance or optimize those things that are normal. And then who gets the goodies? And what are those goodies going to be used for? And this demands realistically a more global appreciation. Neuroscience and neurotechnology and ethics on the world stage must be cosmopolitally cognizant. And there's a lot of individuals and a lot of groups that are doing this worldwide. They're sharing information. In some cases, the information is corrupted. In other cases, the information is retained. It has to be community capable. Who are the groups that are using these things together? It must accommodate pluralist needs, values, norms, and mores, and do so realistically, and recognize the effects that it has and the effects that are rendered by economics, politics, and power balances. Without getting too deeply into the details, we've discussed this as a relatively high-risk speedway, if you will. In other words, a super speedway. Lots of technological entries, high pace, big prizes, but not without risks. And if you're going to get on the speedway, you need to pay attention to the on-ramp, an operational neuroethical risk assessment and mitigation paradigm. A 6R approach: responsibility for assessment, research, responsivity, revisions and regulations. And then engaging particular contexts. How, why? Again, we don't have the time or the latitude in this presentation to get down into the weeds, but it's a work in progress, and it needs to be a work in progress because neuroscience and technology is a work in progress. We need to establish various equilibria. We need to balance what is the maximum effect and minimum harms. What are consensus parameters? And if we ask the question, well, as we should, quo vadis, where are we going? We have to be aware of neurobioeconomic savvy, biosecurity by design, and irrelevant and responsive neuroethics. And all those things dictate that we cash a reality check that has adequate, authentic, and valid perspective, pragmatic amount of utility and humility, and gratitude for the fact that we still have the opportunity to, in fact, perhaps leverage this. As my dad liked to tell me when I was a kid, and I'll pass on to you as I pass the horns over to Professor Hughes, I think the issue here is taking good measure of what we've got and what we don't, and what we can and perhaps can't do to define what we should, and then measuring, in fact, what we can do and what we should. We need to measure twice before we make these cuts, because sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, there's no going back. If you're interested in more of my work, I provide it for you here. If you want to get in touch with me, please feel free to reach me. You can reach me at james.giordano@georgetown.edu. Thanks for your time and interest. And I pass the reins over to my esteemed colleague, Professor Hughes. James?
Well, actually, I'm going to just jump in here and thank you, Professor Giordano, for such a rich presentation. It laid out almost every possible important issue I could think of, talking about how we are going to, we hope, control these new technosciences as they impact our future so incredibly powerfully. And I look forward to asking you a few questions, and I'm sure other people do as well. And now I'll introduce James Hughes, James H., who I happen to know, we've met a few times. James has written a book called Citizen Cyborg. He wrote it a while ago, soon after I wrote Cyborg Citizen. And our first few meetings, we enjoyed joking about how publishers control the titles, and we don't have much say in it. I wasn't super happy with some of my titles. I'm not sure James has been happy with all the titles of his book. But I always tell people who read my Cyborg Citizens that they should also read James's Citizen Cyborg. Because though we both are sort of on the left, we have very different politics. And books address fundamentally different things, I think, at their core. James has done amazing work, I've noticed as an outsider, watching the extropian movement become the transhumanist movement, become the post-human movement, in opening up that movement or that group of allied people committed to extreme technological innovations and how they might impact politics. As a social democratic activist, he's made an important contribution to keeping that area free of being dominated just by a few really crazy billionaires with extreme libertarian tendencies. In his professional work, he's at Trinity College in Connecticut. He's the director of institutional planning and research for Trinity. And he also is the founder and executive director, I guess co-founder probably, with the Institute for Ethics in Emerging Technology, which does a lot of great work on these exact same issues. So it's a pleasure to see James here, not in the flesh, I guess, but in the pixels. And I look forward very much to hearing your presentation. James H.
I'm actually at UMass Boston now, Chris.
Oh, bummer. I didn't know that.
Much more felicitous political environment for me. So my perspective on brain-computer interfaces is a part of my broader perspective on emerging technologies, which is that many of the questions that people raise about them tend to be discontinuous from existing regulatory or technological issues. In other words, they think that once we have X, then everything's going to be different. It's going to raise all these new questions. We're not ready. And my first response usually is to point out the continuity of whatever particular question they think a new technology raises, the continuity with all the things that have come before. A continuity with some questions, which I don't really think can be argued, which I'll address, but continuity also with questions that we've already got answers to. So those are the two basic kinds of things I want to talk about briefly, is what I consider the non-issues in emerging technologies, and in particular BCIs, and what I consider the issues that we have precedents that we can already work from. So some of the non-issues I'm going to address, and this doesn't mean to say that there aren't things to discuss here, but that I don't think are legitimate reasons to say we shouldn't proceed with BCI research, or that that they pose some novel question that we can't possibly answer. The first is the question of super soldiers, and Jim can tell us a lot more about that, and his work on this is great. But the ethics of using novel technologies to enhance the power of a military force, or to change the capabilities of an individual soldier, which has definitely been one of the ways that BCIs are going to be advanced, attempting to fly jets with your brain, for instance. I don't think that there's any obvious ethical argument about the technology itself. In other words, if you think that it's appropriate to use X weapon to defend yourself against Hitler or whatever, the aliens that are going to invade, then you think X technology is good. And if you don't like any of the existent military conflicts that we're involved in, you may say all military technology is bad. But it's really an argument about how you think a particular technology is going to be used by a particular military. I don't, for instance, with the drone debate, I think that if we came up with ways of using drones for specific purposes, there would be a different debate about these, but using them in ways that create civilian casualties the way that they have been has been more of a debate. I'll come back to that point perhaps later. Sports enhancement is also, I think, a non-issue in this regard, although there's not very many immediate applications of sports enhancement for BCIs. One could certainly eventually imagine that they, like many other forms of enhancement, human enhancement, might be applicable to sports. But I've never seen sports enhancement to be a real ethical issue either, because basically you either have a league in which they are permitted or you have a league in which they're not. And that doesn't really have much implication for the rest of society. If you do create leagues in which human enhanced athletes can compete against each other, such as the steroid league for bodybuilding, it may have some spillover effect in the rest of society. So that might be one possible effect, but I don't think it's terribly relevant to the rest of us. I'm going to be a little bit controversial because I do not consider the argument, I believe in informed consent. I think individuals, adults should be able to take on whatever kinds of therapies and enhancements they choose or deny them. Where we have an issue is what we expect parents to do for children or society to do for children. And there will be some differences of opinion between certain advocates of disability rights and others who think that if a child has the capacity to hear, for instance, that they should have a cochlear implant or et cetera, other kinds of situations. But in terms of the threat that a particular BCI may pose to particular cultures or subcultures that have grown up around particular kinds of disabilities, I don't consider that to be an issue that I can really argue against. I don't know why one would argue that people shouldn't have a right to choose a technology just because it might reduce the numbers in a particular subculture. And similarly, I don't consider arguments about human authenticity to be that interesting because as we do the research into the ways that people experience themselves, for instance, with psychotropic drugs, SSRIs, ADD drugs, some people, when they take these drugs, consider themselves to be more themselves, and some people consider themselves to be less themselves. I think sometimes we have a misplaced anxiety about authenticity, and certainly some people will not want to get brain-computer interfaces because they consider them somehow to be a violation of their internal authenticity. And I think they should have that choice. But I think the research shows that many people are able to adapt very quickly to having a sense of self that includes a prosthetic or a brain-computer interface. Now, real briefly, again, some of the problems that I do think we have been addressing and will need to address around these issues. One is safety. We have to have a clinical trial process. The Food and Drug Administration has, through its regulatory authority, the ability to regulate brain-computer interfaces. The Center for Devices and Radiological Health, as far as I'm concerned, should be better funded. It should be able to do autonomous research. It should be able to mandate, like the entire FDA process, it should be able to mandate the collection of clinical trial data from people who are doing trials, and should be able to compel post-approval adverse events. All of these are the underpowerment of our regulatory environment. I think they should be more powered, but that's not a direct criticism of BCIs or any other particular technology. I think we can and are addressing the safety issues through the existing mechanisms. As Jim noted, the definition of what a disability is going to be something that we're going to have to address around BCIs as we do with other things. How much depression is treatable depression, how much ADD is treatable ADD, all of these are things we've already been dealing with for a long time. And the critique of the medicalization of society or the disability critique of ableism in our society, all of these point to the fact that we need to interrogate these boundaries between what is a disability and what is not a disability, and what should be reimbursed for and what shouldn't be reimbursed for instance. So for instance, Medicare changed its definition for a coverable cochlear implant from deafness to severe hearing loss, and that in and itself expanded coverage for millions of seniors. Now, if you're an opponent of cochlear implants and trying to defend the size of the deaf community, that would be a problematic public policy intervention. I consider it an enabling and democratic intervention to say, well, if you think that you might benefit from this, go ahead and give it a chance. Privacy and cybersecurity, I include this film Made for Love here because this woman, her husband's like an Elon Musk crazy scientist. And when she's unconscious, he slips a chip in her head that allows him access to her thoughts and her sensorium. It's an HBO movie that came out. Obviously, we don't want that to happen. But one of the problems with Luddite popular culture is that it says, oh, if we have X technology, the worst possible scenarios will come out. I think we will need to figure out the privacy of brain-computer interfaces and the data that they create. Obviously, we've already seen that some implants that people have, such as insulin pumps and heart pacemakers, if they have a Wi-Fi connection or a Bluetooth connection to the world, that they can be hacked. And so we know that hacking of implants will be attempted and that need to be prevented. And we know that the privacy of the data in a recording device in your brain would certainly be something of interest to people, and that we'll have to have some law to determine who gets access to that and when. Back in 1972, Michael Crichton wrote The Terminal Man to reflect. It was one of, I think, his first novel. And it was about a guy, it was based on some research that had already been done on sticking wires in the heads of mice and rats. And the classic observation in one experiment that they preferred hitting the pleasure button rather than taking cocaine, I think it was in that case, or perhaps it was just eating food. But anyway, they starved to death hitting the pleasure button on a device that was zapping their brain. And so ever since then, there's been this concern that if we start mucking around, putting brain pacemakers in, antidepressant, deep brain stimulation, there's been this concern that it could possibly have an effect on addiction, that it could you could be addicted to the kinds of pleasure that would give, and especially if the person themselves had a direct control over how often they get hit with the dopamine or the serotonin or whatever. And so I do think that we will have to carefully monitor this. It hasn't really come up so far as I have seen in the research that's been done for 25 years now about how to put computer brain interfaces into people's heads. And the vast number of people now, hundreds of thousands of people who have deep brain stimulation. I don't think it's that this particular terminal man going insane because you're making yourself an addict to brain wireheading has been a problem, but it will have to be one that we watch carefully. Unequal access. This is the Pew Research Center has done surveys of Americans asking about a variety of emerging technologies. This is from a 2016 survey that they did, asking about, among other things, whether people were interested in having brain chip implants. And in particular, they asked, what if it was possible to use a brain chip implant to improve your concentration, your memory, and to have possibly better, more powers than an ordinary human being. And what they found was that one of the top concerns that people have about this, and they found this repeatedly in the research, was that it would increase inequality in society. If this is an expensive thing to get and only the wealthy have access to it, and it increases, it's truly an enhancement, that is, it really increases your capacity to do stuff, well, then the rich are going to get more and more capable and the poor are going to get, stay where they are. So I think inequality is one of the major concerns that people bring to this discussion, and it's a legitimate concern. In the United States, because we have private health insurance, we have to negotiate with the fact that we either do it through federal policy mandating all private insurance has to provide such a thing to everyone, and provide it through Medicare and so forth. But in most countries, this debate is about whether something's going to be covered by the national health insurance plan. Hopefully, we will eventually be such a country. But right now, it is certainly true that if you have a platinum health insurance plan and they decide to cover brain implants that give you an IQ of 1,000 and none of the other insurance plans are doing that would be a problem. And that's a problem we're going to have to confront. Related to that issue is the question about superhuman abilities. And here you see the Pew research asked people, would you get a brain plant in a brain chip to improve your concentration? And a third of Americans said that they would, and more than a third said that they thought others would. So this is the classic, well, I wouldn't do it, but I think most people would want that. And down here, they asked, what if it was gave you capabilities far above that of any human known to date? And here, still a third thought that that would be an appropriate use for a computer chip. So I think often we don't, just talking to our peers, we don't have a sense of how broad the market for these kinds of things would be. I think by the time they actually came to market, there would be a broader market than this, but this was 5 years ago, people asking people about this. And I just include this chart of other cognitive enhancements. It's like part of the question that we're going to have to determine here is, okay, you started with this brain, you started with impaired memory because of Alzheimer's disease. I gave you this device and it increased your memory capacity to be in the top 10 percentile of Americans. Is that okay? Clearly you're above average. You were below average and now you're above average. Is that an enhancement that we shouldn't do? What if it increases you to above the memory capacity of all extant human beings? Is that an enhancement we shouldn't do? Those are the kinds of questions that we're going to have to deal with in this context. And finally, one of the questions I think that the rapid pace of emerging technologies poses, and that has made me think differently about, for instance, end-of-life care. I mean, I used to be a strong, everybody should have the right to commit suicide under whatever circumstances. And if a family member comes in and says, well, hold on, if we keep them in this coma for another 3 years, we might come up with something that fixes them. In the past, in the 90s, I would have said, well, that's silly, just let them go. Now, things are moving very quickly. And if I, was gorked out, my wife wanted to wait a couple of years to see how, what technologies might come along that would improve my capacity to wake back up, then I would appreciate that intervention. So I think we're in a very weird situation. And this is, again, a situation that we've already been in because cochlear implants, for instance, already pose this kind of a problem for kids because they have a critical window in which you put them in, but if you can't put them in twice, and if you wait a couple of years, the technology of the cochlear implant is going to get better and better and better. And so I think we're going to have a problem with kind of timing when we do things to our brains, which is probably we only want to do it once, since the technology is evolving so rapidly. So this is that novel, if you want to go back and see the Luddite anxieties that Michael Crichton tried to whip up back in the 1970s around brain-computer interfaces. And I can be reached at director@iet.org. Thanks.
Well, thanks, James H. What a great presentation. And especially your optimism is a breath of fresh air. And this comes from someone who's often accused of being overly optimistic, but clearly compared to you, I'm not. So I'm wondering if Lucia has a first question. You want to go?
Surely. So I'm going to say that, one of the biggest questions for me is always in that, two questions. One is always in that justice space, right? Dr. G brought up power and brought up Foucault, who has the technology, who has the ability to share it when it's shared, et cetera. Talk to me a little bit about, and talk to the group a little bit about the justice aspect of these technologies, who's actually going to be able to use them.
Yeah, so let me jump on that first in terms of what I'll call the technology readiness level. In other words, appreciating where the technologies are, state of development, and then what that infers on a broader basis. And then I'll hand the reins over to Jim Hughes, because I think he can address the sociological issues perhaps far more adroitly than I can. For many of these devices and for many of these techniques and technologies, the relative TRL, technology readiness level, is high. So in other words, their conversion from bench or from relative research constraints into some application is almost ready to go, if not there already. And the thing we have to appreciate is that right now in the United States and in Europe, Australia, Japan, that conversion, that time takes about 60 calendar months to go from conceptual idea into viable construct in practice. There are data to suggest that right now in China, that has been moved back to be a period of what's called technology realization, about 40 to 48 calendar months. And that's been very explicit as part of what is called a global challenge in being able to advance this technology in some ways that are cooperative. In other words, we can do it in 60 to 65 calendar months. They, whoever they are, can do it in less. How do you work together to be able to create some admixture of that, where aspects of the technology and or its benefit are therefore available with greatest flow through, right? The issue then becomes, well, flow through into what? So are there going to be key communities in which relative commutative justice, in other words, giving that to all who need it, overcomes distributive justice, a limited amount of resources and a high number of individuals, and so some quasi-calculus has to be determined and how this is used. Again, it goes back to, I think, a very important point that James Hughes made, is that in single-party payer systems where there's a relative social balance and distribution of healthcare resources and services, this is really more of a consensus decision that then says, well, okay, if this is our level of preparedness, if this is what we have at our disposal, this represents those things that are, quote, necessary, and this is the, quote, standard of care. That standard of care can be applied anywhere along the spectrum from left to right of bang. Let me explain what I mean. Left of bang is before something goes wrong. Preventive medicine, various forms of occupational medicine, perhaps inclusive of those things that we think to be enablements, enhancements, or optimizations. Right of care, or right of bang, essentially is that type of intervention after something has happened, an insult, an injury, the presence of some congenital or longitudinal disorder. So on one side, we're seeing things like resistance and resilience towards betterment. And on the other side, we're seeing capability of recuperation and essentially restoration, rehabilitation. They fit along a continuum called hope, health, occupational protection, whatever those occupations are, and enablement. The question then becomes, who gets the hope? Who do we keep healthy and how do we target that? What occupations, not only in terms of what people do, but in terms of the actual tasks and professions, are going to be deemed the lowest hanging fruit? And then what enablements and what enhancements, if you will, are going to be viewed as being most viable? Clearly, if there's going to be some social support for this, there needs to be some relative consensus among the decision makers. But in those circumstances, whereby that's not the case, there's always going to be the opportunity for those who can afford it, get it. And as I tried to illustrate, in the contemporary market space, viable over the next 5 to 10 years of opportunity, the availability, in other words, the access to the technologies, may also determine research and medical tourism, which means that those who get it may be able to go elsewhere to get it, which certainly does bring up the possibility of a widening schism between the neurocapabilized haves and have-nots. Before I pass the reins over to James Hughes, it's one of the areas of the contemporary neuroethical framework that my colleague John Shook and I looked at a few years ago. As Professor Hughes said, there are plenty of areas of ethics that work just fine, and they will address these issues. But some of them require at least a little bit of revision to remain apace with the technology in terms of its capability and its relative distributability and what that distribution may mean. We talked about principles such as self-creativity, self-enablement, lack of obsolescence, but also citizenry. And that citizenry is bidirectional, those who get it and those who don't. And these things should be taken in a non-prima facie way so as to be used in some quasi-calculus together rather than discretely. I don't have an answer for you, but I hope that sheds a little bit of light on the topic. Professor Hughes, sir, over to you.
Sure. Well, we live in a society where people are losing legs because they can't afford insulin. And then people will raise an argument if we create new prosthetic limbs, it might exacerbate inequality. So I think we have to take the discussion back to the fact that there are lots of people in the world and in the United States who need better, more assured access to therapeutic medicine. Now, I don't think that we need to use the therapy enhancement distinction in a broader public policy sense, but it will be used to determine who needs coverage for what. And in terms of the inequality question, I think the first thing to say is let's make sure that everybody has access to therapeutic medicine up to the level that is generally accepted to be therapy. Then whether certain things should be accessible that are enhancements beyond that, I think are, I am open to the possibility of being shown a particular enhancement that would exacerbate inequality in society, in which we would have to say, no, not everybody should have that. One of the reasons I'm open to that is I'm for gun control. I don't think everyone should have a tank in their backyard because that's a form of empowerment, a technology that empowers people in a way that I do not think is good for society if we try to universalize access to it. On the other hand, life extension, I don't see how inequalities in access to life extension pose the same kind of existential threat to society. I think they're morally wrong. I think we should try to make sure everyone has as equal access to life extension as possible. But it's not as if you're going to use those extra 10 years from 80 to 90 to, become Lex Luthor and take over society. So I think a lot of our fantasies about cyborgization and their effects on inequality, ignore the fact that the people who are going to be using these for the foreseeable future, 10, 20 years, are going to be the disabled. They're going to be people whose only option, because they are severely paralyzed or because their brain has been partially destroyed by some kind of accident or disease, they need to use this technology in order to get anywhere close back to where they want to be. And once it's demonstrated its efficacy there, then there may be applications of those technologies which would raise questions for a broader social equality if they were more accessible to the rich and powerful. And that's when we have to think about that. And I'm open to that discussion, but I just don't see most of the things that we're discussing as being problematic for equality in that particular way.
Let me just roll back on that if I could, because there is one point that I think needs to be brought to the fore. And that is that there are select communities of potential users who have a particular stake in shareholder values that might enable them to have access to certain types of techniques and technologies in the brain sciences and elsewhere that are differential. I mean, as you know, in full transparency, I've done an awful lot of work, continue to do an awful lot of work on the military intelligence side, not only domestically, but internationally. And there is the consideration that that acronym HOPE is very, very applicable within military medicine, and much of military medicine is on the preventive side. And there is a gray zone between what constitutes preventive military medicine from those things that keep an individual healthy by affording them occupational and/or operational protections by virtue of enabling certain aspects of their capability. And those are things that need to be addressed. The question then rolls out, and very applicable and in agreement with what you've said, Jim, is, well, what happens when these individuals aren't doing that job anymore? And then what does that portend, for example, for the larger issue? In many ways, it actually relates back to gun control. So those are important issues to explore, but I think that there is, I'm not going to say the outlier, but there is that percolation of a particular community that not only has high expressed interest in early development and technological translation, but then that particular utility and the need for that utility, or at least to address it, also could raise secondary, tertiary questions for society at large.
Okay. I often quip that if we're concerned about the unequitable consequences of spending on emerging medical technologies, the first place to start is redirecting all the money we spend on pet food, because that would give us trillions of dollars. We could, how many bed nets could we buy with all that pet food money out there? So.
That's a fantastic analogy, Dr. Hughes and Dr. G. Thank you so much for that. I'll add that I think when you see stories such as Elon Musk and his pigs and his monkeys, you start wondering where reality actually exists, right? Are we actually in the medical space, or are we actually going to have someone who's going to advance it to the point of possibly fashionable and frivolous, and what that means? But I'll point us now to some questions around cybersecurity. There's a question in the chat around cybersecurity. Who is it for? Possibly what does it mean? What does it do in cases of other countries, patients, governments? So talk to us a little bit both about, what are your concerns around cybersecurity? Both of you touched upon privacy and security, somewhat of such as old problems, but where does it stand as a new problem?
Can I jump in and make?
Oh yeah, sure.
And include hacking on that, please.
Sure.
In this book I recently edited with a couple of my colleagues, Modified Living as a Cyborg, 2 women who have heart implants write about the work they had to do to find out the coding in the actual implants in their chests. And when they finally did, one of them had to actually hack the code. She's a Canadian. She discovered the security was minimal, and someone easily could have hacked her heart and given her a heart attack. Now, her and her colleague, they managed to change the regulations in Canada and the EU. The other woman is from Norway, so that in fact patients have rights to access the codes and so on, to know what the codes are in their heart. But notice what the companies argued that would try to block this. They said it was corporate intellectual property, and the corporate values were too important for them to allow the patient to know what was in their heart. Now, can be sure that in China, when people get heart implants, the government considers this information proprietary, and they don't want people to get it. I don't see any evidence that those with great power in our societies, whether it's corporations in North America and Europe, or the government itself in China, are going to be open to sharing information like this. I think this is a massive problem that goes to the heart of all these new technologies.
Yeah, let me jump in on that if I could. So here I would bring the audience and those people who are participatory to some of the work that I've had the pleasure of doing with my colleagues, Dr. Diane DeEulis and Dr. Charles Lutz from the National Defense University. I mean, one of the main concerns here for us is that big data and decision technologies are an integral part of capabilizing the brain sciences so that those things that we can assess then create viability to accessibility and therefore affectability, and vice versa. There are some real issues here. I mean, the issues, number one, is the ubiquity of those data and relative provenance and custodianship of data. That then brings the issue to something called biocybersecurity. And again, I refer you here to some of the work that Dr. Diane DeEulis and I have done. There are a number of things we did on the sort of intermediate classified side, which is called CUI, confidential unclassified information, that speak to exactly what Professor Albus-Gray just said, is that there are vulnerabilities, there are weak links. And of course, any chain is only as strong as those weak links. And to carry that analogy further, let me explain that although the actual nodes of data themselves may be relatively secure, and I can attest to the relative security because this was one of the primary issues that was brought up coming from the BRAIN Initiative, particularly those issues that were generated by the Biotechnologies Office, the BTO office of DARPA, with those projects that were data heavy as part of the BRAIN Initiative. This is a systemic and emerging technologies for viable therapies, subnets, RAM, restoring active memory, and certainly huge priority for the current N-cubed project, next generation non-invasive neuromodulation, that essentially seeks to engage remote access to the living brain. But the issue becomes, well, it's not just how secure the actual nodes, but when you need to transfer data from node to allow for its relative accessibility, real-time utilization, assimilation, synthesis, and their time capability, well, you have to go through the network. In other words, these things stack. And there's an old adage, and I'm not a computational guru, but I certainly listen to those who advise on a variety of levels, both nationally and internationally. The things that are stackable are hackable, and things that are hackable are modifiable, and modifiability could lead to corruptibility. And as Karen Feinberg noted, well, then that takes on a new definition of what could constitute as a potential biological weapon in bioterrorism. And the good news is that beginning in 2016 and 2017, the Australia Commission, the Australia group, to the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, brought up the viability of big data, AI, and various neurotechnologies as needing to be at least within the auspices of what might be viably weaponized on a variety of levels, from the very non-kinetic, in other words, from covert clandestine operations of data manipulation, all the way to being able to utilize data and sell data to develop precision pathologies, and not just in the area of bugs, microbes, viruses, fungi, and not just in the area of bugs that could affect humans, but also agribusiness, livestock, et cetera, but also in the ability to develop precision pathologies or pathological inferences and interventions in terms of specific drugs that match to genotype and phenotype, devices that are based upon specificity of environments, architectures, geographies, anthropometry, et cetera. So I think that as we move forward, there needs to be that level of biosecurity by design, inclusive of biocybersecurity by design, and that needs to be built into the evolution. James, over to you.
Well, you know, we live in a society where people rightly are concerned about the data security and the hackability of potential implants and brain computer devices, but they will turn over their data and their privacy to a dozen different corporations that then feed them videos and ads all day on 20 different devices about how they should be voting and acting. So I think there's the sociological question is kind of interesting here. It's like if the concern is that you're going to have your brain computer data hacked and your behavior controlled that way, or at least the people will be able to see what's happening in your brain and be able to use that in some way, then I think that's a broader concern. And we're trying to figure that out with Facebook and EU, GNDPR and all the other kinds of regulatory processes that we're throwing at big data right now. And China, Xi has come up with his own policies to try to rein in the power of big tech and ensure some data privacy, at least not from the CCP, but from other people. So I think this is a broader issue, and it will have to be solved. But I don't think that it's particular to this case. And I would introduce the concept here of the exocortex, and that is that all these devices that we carry around are devices that are beginning to take on parts of our cognition. And the extended mind perspective and the philosophy of mind is that not all cognition happens inside the brain, and especially with the exocortex, with all the devices that we use for cognition, that's true as well. So the question's really not about, well, what if they hack something that's inside my body? It's what if they hack any of the things that I use for my cognition that stores my memory and that could shape my behavior? And I think those are legitimate questions and we need to solve them, yeah.
So bring that, I think that's fascinating about sort of that exocortex. You have Elon Musk talking about tertiary. As you can tell, I just recently read some of articles on him. And he talks about that. And I'll bring it back to sort of the sociopolitical issue around this technology, but many of the technologies. SHCI has explored nanotechnology, AI extensively. And when you think about it, there's always going to be a growing resistance against these types of technologies or the democratizing of ableism. So talk to us about those elements of this. Dr. Hughes?
Yeah, James, you take that one.
You're throwing me to the wolves.
Dr. G, you could have too, but we're going to go for a little sociopolitical work right now.
You're the defense guy. You're better armed than I am.
No, it's right in your sandbox. I'll take it after you. How's that?
Look, I am a strong advocate of bodily autonomy, cognitive liberty, neurodiversity. And so I think we do need to interrogate the ableist assumptions that we may be bringing to this and how we want to exercise, for instance, pressure that we put on parents for what kinds of therapies to give them their kids. I was an early diagnosee of ADD and back in the 1960s, just narrowly missed being called a minimal brain dysfunction kid. It was called hyperactive instead, got put on Ritalin. And I think that this debate has harmed some kids in both directions. There are some kids who have gotten more of these kinds of interventions than they need, and some kids who've gotten less because their parents don't believe in the authenticity of a medicated brain, for instance. Now, when it comes to deafness, again, I think any adult should be allowed to choose deafness, whether they were headed that way or not. But when it comes to whether we should, as a society, preference children having as many abilities as possible, and if there's an easy intervention to give them an ability they don't already have, I think that should be the preference of public policy. So I think it's a complicated answer. I don't want to see things being done willy-nilly to adults or children without due consideration. But I think we do have an obligation to say, eventually there's going to be a therapy, a drug, a gene therapy, a brain-computer interface, which would, for instance, be a treatment for Down syndrome, or at least for the cognitive disabilities of Down syndrome. And if we say to parents, completely up to you, whether you do this or not, I think we're defaulting on our responsibility to kids. But in terms of adults, any adult, I think, should be able to make an informed decision about whether they use these technologies. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. I think it goes to, who's making these decisions, and both on that individual scale, that collective scale at the community level, but then we're looking at government and geopolitical situations as well. Dr. G or Dr. Gray, thoughts around some of these meetings?
I'll jump in a little, only because I don't want to get castigated that I passed a difficult question over to James, and it was. I mean, he handled it beautifully. we have a mutual colleague of ours, Irina Singh, at the University of Oxford. And she too is a sociologist and deals with a lot of the sociological issues at that proverbial, and I use the word proverbial almost like colloquial, treatment enhancement border, because there are fuzzy areas to those distinctions based upon what is defined to be normal under what contexts, and then quote, who gets what given those things. Again, here we could look at the ADD, ADHD spectrum and continuum. We have to put some arbitrary threshold on that spectrum to determine at what point intervention might be viable, or do you literally surrender it back to the individual and say, well, when do you want certain interventions and what interventions do you want? And then, of course, you have to examine, as I've said before, not to sound like a broken record, how various idiosyncratic capabilities or constraints are also affecting and affected by systemic capabilities and constraints, which gets back to the idea of obsolescence, citizenry, empowerment, enablement, etc. So I think that a couple of things come to the fore. Number one, when we're dealing with minors, it becomes critical to understand the entirety of the situation. You're dealing with a developing brain. We don't necessarily know what those trajectories are fully like to begin with. They're differential in individuals. This is part of the mission of pediatric personalized medicine. It's not only diagnostic, it's also definitive. But we also don't understand what these particular interactions may do, and therefore we must tread with caution. That doesn't mean we shouldn't tread, because as James Hughes very well said, there are those individuals who value desiderata of getting these things, the needs desiderata are very, very high, and for good reason. This is one of the things, for example, that goes into certain types of deep brain stimulation in the pediatric population. You have to really try to balance the benefit with the burden and the risk. And in some cases, the benefit is that changes in certain aspects of cognition, emotion, and or behavior are going to induce particular social changes, amenabilities, et cetera, that might therefore defer, might be more long-term longitudinal effects in adulthood. But I think, trying to determine a universally applicable calculus or quasi-calculus becomes difficult. As I had in our slide, one of the approaches that we've advocated, not the only approach, but in coming to the table, is to use some form of an approach advocated by the philosopher John Rawls, as called minimax and maximin. In other words, maximum benefit to those who have minimum access or minimum capability, and then vice versa. But part of that was predicated on something called a reflective equilibrium, which I think is very, very important, which then conjoins the individuals to the discourse and dialectic. In other words, nothing about us without us, as hearkened from the deaf community. But I also think that there are other forms of balancing equilibrium. So, for example, some of the work of Thagard and colleagues has been useful because there is a measure of utility in both rule and act. So it's not an easy answer, but I think that as we're preparing ourselves for things like personalized and precision medicine, and these are in fact bioscientific and biomedical type interventions, I think that the same level of scrutiny and granularity that we would take towards individualizing any treatment needs to be considered and opted in here.
Thank you for that. Dr. Gray?
I actually find myself growing more and more pessimistic the more I listen. Both of the Jameses have a very sweet view of how society could possibly work if people paid attention to these very helpful metrics for thinking about ethical issues and if public policy was this or that. But having recently gone through the deaths of both my parents and seen how the profit motive of HMOs and how doctors and nurses are constrained by that and how they deal with people who are sick and or dying, I'm very cynical about the direction medicine is taking, for example, in the United States. And I hear from Europe too, even with socialized medical systems, the bureaucracy becomes more and more of a problem. And then stepping back a little further, we look at the current pandemic crisis and how, in fact, in many ways, the world failed to deal with this in an effective way. And some of the most effective responses to the pandemic were the most authoritarian, as in China, which gives one real pause for concern, or in New Zealand becoming a bit authoritarian in a good way, I would argue, but many New Zealanders disagree. And then when you have populist authoritarians like we had here in the US with Trump, and as Brazil and Hungary and the Philippines and Russia all have populist authoritarians who had no interest in science or in public health and just manipulated the crisis for their own purposes. That gives me more pessimism. And then if you step one step further back to the abyss, our whole civilization is facing a crisis with climate based on the total failure to understand and manage industrialization. And now we're talking about a whole new wave of manipulations of the physical environment with a political system that is still driving straight into the abyss in terms of climate. I see no cause for optimism. I see appeals to ethical frameworks and this public policy would be good and this one would be bad. Sound, frankly, to my ears, hollow. Not good enough. We are not doing good enough on the climate. We are not doing good enough on the pandemic. And I see no reason to think we would do good enough at all in how these technologies will be used in the future. I have all sorts of nightmare science fiction scenarios going around in my head. And I have to say that and this would be my last part of this little rant, my biggest concern with a lot of people, even who do this kind of thinking, as our two really brilliant panelists do, is we do not have a grasp of how exponential change really impacts us. There are more scientists and engineers alive right now than in all the rest of history combined, and they have better equipment. The pace of technological and scientific change is continuing to accelerate, as well as mass extinctions, carbon in the air, and the human population. These things are all interrelated. And unless there's a fundamental change in how humans govern themselves, we are headed for collapse.
Look, I don't disagree with anything you've said. I think a big part of being pragmatic, and I think if you held a gun in my mouth and said, well, are you an optimist or a pessimist? I would deny either and say I'm a pragmatist. But I think a big part of pragmatism is a healthy dose of skepsis. I mean, it's sort of the chastity belt of rationality. And I, like you, have said elsewhere and in print that civic institutions, many civic institutions, are simply not prepared to adequately deal with this developmental march of technology, as evidenced by the relative responsivity of public policy guidelines and just relative preparedness as evidenced by other issues that involve science and tech. Again, I bring to the fore some of the work of my colleague John Shook and I that have published in Frontiers in Sociology, although we were talking about something that has a bit of a science fictional sniff, in other words, moral enhancement. We easily sort of dismissed the idea of moral enhancement and just went over to the idea of capitalization and enhancement, where morality sits in that. And you're absolutely right. But whether that's fuel for pessimism, or whether that then becomes the impetus to sort of take a deeper look, I think I get my feeling on this is we can take a look at this two ways. We can look at this through the lens and say, all right, look, this is what's happening in neuroscience and technology. This is who's doing the work worldwide. These are the extant systems, et cetera. But I think it becomes problematic, if not inadequate. And in some cases, I would say intellectually, if not sociologically criminal, to use that lens as a mirror and then say, all right, now wait a minute, based upon what it is we know, not only about the science and technology, but also about ourselves, are we really ready to do this? Which harkens back to the idea earlier about measure twice and cut once. Part of the things we have to measure is our own capabilities and what we've dealt with so far. And are we really ready to make that cut to go on to the next level of capabilization? I don't disagree with you. I think there are plenty of areas of contemporary sociopolitics that are heinously wanting for revisitation and revision. But I also think that, as you said, it's going to take a wider discourse. And more than that, I think it's actually going to take more of a dialectical engagement rather than discourse, because there are going to be perspectives that don't align.
Well, Chris, as you noted, our politics are a little bit different. And Michael Harrington always used to say that there was a silver lining to every cloud. So perhaps that's my approach to technopolitics as well. I did take a moment to dilate on the question of the FDA, which is that I think the FDA is not adequate to the tasks that we've faced it. But in the last year, we've seen an extraordinary thing, which is the development and distribution to many, not as many as it should have been, but to many, of vaccines, which would have taken much longer. And I think that the clinical science was adequate. So although I have criticisms of our regulatory state, I think that it is currently the basis on which we want to pursue all kinds of medicine, unless one's arguing that we shouldn't have any new medicines or technologies because the regulatory state's inadequate, then I don't see why we wouldn't have research on this one. As to authoritarianism, the Third Reich accomplished what they needed to do with railroad tracks and a gas. And if the United States had banned railroad tracks and Zyklon B, it would have had no effect on the ability of the Third Reich to do what they did. I don't think our pursuing brain-computer interfaces for people with severe brain disorders or prosthetic limbs or whatever the kinds of technology we want to pursue is going to make it more or less likely that Xi will try to put a chip in everybody's head. And yes, if Trump gets reelected and wants to put a chip in everybody's head, I'm going to be against putting a chip in everybody's head, but it has nothing to do with putting chips in head. It has to do with Trump, not with chips.
That's fantastic. See, when you go into socio-political, geopolitical space, it just gets even more interesting. But I'm going to bring us to two questions. The first one I'm going to ask to respect one of our participants is a question around the use of young people and the use of social media. She references an event that she was at and an FDA approved video game for ADHD. So here I think she's pointing to an example of sort of an external computer-based item device that is now driving children to use it and potentially to manage. I'll use that word broadly, manage symptoms, behaviors. What do you have to say about that? And then I do have a finishing question, so we'll keep this one brief.
Well, let me jump in real quickly if I could. And part of the reason I'd like to is because I think I was actually participatory in some of the discourse leading that was focused on that exact technology. Please understand that a direct-to-consumer device cannot be utilized to treat an existing medical condition or diagnose a medical condition. If it's direct-to-consumer. If it's gate-kept through some biomedical entity, then yes, it can. So something is manufactured and it is gate-kept by some biomedical entity, and that biomedical entity need not necessarily be an allopathic, osteopathic physician. It can also be, for example, a clinical psychologist. Then that's a fuzzy zone. And there's an equal problem in terms of operational definition of what constitutes a diagnosis or treatment. And part of that is the verbiage that is used. Does this device do something that a pre-existing device does, and therefore is it blanketed in under a pre-existing clause? Or is it doing something new, or is it doing it in a way that is novel and therefore needs a new claim as potentially investigative device, which then, okay. But if it's going direct to consumers, there has to be evidence to support that this is not being used to do that. Or in other words, diagnose or treat a disorder. Can it improve certain areas of function that may be problematic in disorders? Yes, it can. And then this gets very sticky because then you get into the issue of what the FDA has sort of some relative viability over in terms of what represents their area of continuity and control. What really represents viable claims by the Federal Trade Commission. And I must tell you that those gears don't always mesh smoothly. So I think the issue here is one of seeing what that direct-to-consumer market portends. And there is a direct-to-consumer neurotechnology market. Our group has done a lot of work with that, particularly as relates to what's called LOTUS, low output transcranial electrical stimulating devices, as well as the use of virtual devices, such as video games, that may be able to be utilized together or absent with forms of neuro and or biofeedback. And in some cases, part of those regulatory parameters post-FDA become very foggy. Here too, we've called for more stringency. But the other thing that I really want to make people aware of is that there is also a do-it-yourself market. And while not problematic per se, I mean, there's nothing inherently capricious or nefarious about that market. Doing it yourself, particularly for individuals who may not necessarily lack the capability, the training, or the insight, can lead to problems on its own. not only in terms of penetrability of the do-it-yourself community to possible nefarious interests, but let's face it, I mean, I can work on a basic engine just fine. Now, I crack open the hood on a 2022 automobile that's a computerized engine. So again, it depends on level of skill. It also depends on level of penetrability into a relative sovereignty. And these are real questions. James, over to you.
Well, this is a good example of why I think it's important to broaden the frame to include the exocortex, all the ways in which our electronic environment influences our cognition, because really, most of us will not want to open our skulls to put things in our brain for quite a long time. And I don't think we should be allowed to until it's quite demonstrated to be safe. But we're already doing all kinds of things to our brains with this electronic environment, not to mention drugs and potentially gene therapies. So I think many of the questions and many of the intended applications that we might use for BCIs will be things that we'll have with external media first. Secondly, there's a huge problem with hype, and that is evident in this field because most of the brain games, once they're researched and their effects on cognition, there's no lasting improvement in concentration and memory and so forth. And I believe in the diagnosis of ADD. I think that I have had it, and I think my kids had it, and so forth. But I've never seen any evidence that brain games were useful for treating ADD. Now, I'm open to the possibility that biofeedback and neurofeedback will eventually work in that way, but it doesn't yet. So I think that, as Jim quite rightly pointed out, sometimes these are not actually, unless you're opening somebody's brain to put something in their skull, it's not doesn't have to go through the FDA, and it's more a Federal Trade Commission kind of a thing. But yes, somebody should be calling them on the fact that some of their technologies don't actually work.
Fantastic. So I think we've touched on a lot of things. We're coming up about 5 minutes before our stop. And I want to take you to sort of a fairy tale place. We had a question in the poll that talked about, what might be one of the most dynamic applications of this. So I would ask both Dr. Hughes, Dr. Giordano, as well as Dr. Gray, to think about what would be the most dynamic application and leave us dreaming as we bring this session to a close.
Okay, so this is fantasy, right? This is
absolutely
okay. So we're talking like unicorns and winged creatures.
Let's finish it on that. We've kept it very real around the sociology, the morality, and philosophy of this technology. So
okay,
bring it.
So let's bring this down to a very real issue. DARPA's N-cubed program and/or Neuralink that allows inter-individual communication in relatively real time remotely. Those are real capabilities. That's the actual intent. That's the science. Now let's take those things and put them in a non-human head. Before you start thinking, well, that's just crazy, please look up the cetacean transfer communication issue. A real project looking at communication issues of sperm whales. This gets to a very interesting question, which is if an organism has the relative wetware, does it run our program? And it's simply a question of access of communicability to understand others' consciousnesses. And so one of the key areas that's been discussed a little bit on the woo-woo side, but quite really is, if we now have the technology that accesses another's, quote, mind, what do we do with that information? Just saying.
I don't know, but I'm loving the idea, and I love whales as well. So the telepathy is intriguing. Dr. Hughes?
Well, Ray Kurzweil is not right about everything, but I think in this particular case, his scenario of the way that brain-computer interfaces will evolve is something that I generally believe. I think computing and robotics are going to get faster, smarter, and smaller. And eventually they're going to be small enough that we'll be able to populate our skulls with trillions of little devices that will be able to communicate with our neurons. And that will allow us to record, back up our memories and our skills and personality. It'll allow us to telepathically communicate with other people. It'll allow us to experience virtual reality just with a flick of a switch. I think all those things will eventually happen. The question is how quickly. It might be a century, it might be 50 years, depending on the accelerating pace of technological innovation. So I don't see anything that has thrown us off that particular path. Now, the big nut to crack right now is understanding brain language, to try to understand how neurons turn electrical impulses into thoughts and what level of abstraction and artificial intelligence we're going to need to capture that. But that's where we're at right now, is taking a couple thousand pins in a brain and trying to figure out brain language from what's happening and how people behave. And I think eventually that will lead to this full vision.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gray. And then we'll finish with our president.
Well, first, I want to thank Lucia for being such a great moderator. I don't think I was much of a moderator as just an, I don't know, a cranky participant. But if I was to be optimistic, I would love an implant so I could speak Catalan and speak Spanish better. I have no skill with languages, and I've spent my whole life trying to become fluent in Spanish and learn a little Catalan, and to be able to just do that would just bring me incredible joy.
Well, being that I'm a Spanish speaker, that makes me very happy. President Chris?
Well, both me and Dr. Camps, we're just a facilitator in this awesome discussion. I think this is one of the things that this discussion that we just have is one of these events that a lot of our colleagues, when they read about it, they will think that was a science fiction. And you just made it significantly less fiction, much more science. As a practicing neuro ICU doctor, I have to say that hearing that I may actually have a different conversation with some of my patients. It's a little bit worrisome and may signify some change in the practice. I also want to say that all of you have a certain experience with the healthcare. I understand that concern being exactly and precisely in the middle. But I think the good thing about this meeting is that we all finish on the quite optimistic note. We're coming from different backgrounds, from different expectations, and we learn all about, as much as we could, about the brain interest machine. And I think there's a future over there, and both me and Dr. Camps will work towards the next year. Thank you very much for your knowledge and in-depth insights. And both Chris and Lucia for outstanding leading on this discussion to the fruitful end. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you guys next year.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.